Hey guys, tonight we set sail on one of the greatest adventures ever told, the complete story of the Odyssey. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins not in Ithaca, but on the smoking ruins of Troy. After 10 long years of war, the greatest conflict in Greek mythology has finally come to an end. The mighty city that once seemed impossible to conquer has fallen, not through overwhelming strength, but through one man's extraordinary cunning. The famous wooden horse, remembered for thousands of years as one of history's greatest military deceptions, was the invention of Odysseus, king of the small island of Ithaca. While other heroes earned glory through unmatched strength or fearless charges into battle, Odysseus built his reputation differently. He was a master of strategy, persuasion, and quick thinking. In a world where warriors often solved problems by hitting them with spears, Odysseus had the rather unusual habit of using his brain first. It occasionally kept everyone alive. With Troy destroyed, the Greek kings prepare to sail home. Agamemnon returns to Mycenae. Menelaus begins his own difficult voyage back to Sparta. Nestor heads for Pylos. Odysseus also dreams of home, though for him, that dream has become almost painful. 20 years have now passed since he first left Ithaca. 10 years before the war were spent gathering armies, honouring oaths, and preparing for the campaign. Then came another 10 years beneath the walls of Troy. Back home, everything has changed. His son, Telemachus, was only an infant when Odysseus departed. Now he is nearly a grown man who barely remembers his father's face. His wife, Penelope, has ruled the household alone for 2 decades, refusing to believe that her husband is gone forever, despite increasing pressure to remarry. Odysseus has only one wish left, to see them again. He gathers 12 sturdy ships and hundreds of weary veterans. These are men who have survived sieges, duels, famine, disease, storms, and enough arguments between Greek kings to last several lifetimes. They believe the hardest part is finally over. They could not be more mistaken. Before long, the fleet reaches the land of the Cicones, allies of the defeated Trojans. The Greeks attack the coastal city of Ismarus, capturing supplies, treasure, and livestock. At first, everything goes according to plan. Odysseus urges his men to leave immediately while they still have the advantage. Unfortunately, discipline proves far less durable than bronze armour. Instead of boarding the ships, many soldiers remain behind to feast. Wine flows freely. Livestock is roasted over open fires. Victory celebrations grow louder with every passing hour. After surviving 10 years of war, they convince themselves they have earned one carefree afternoon. The Cicones, however, are busy gathering reinforcements from neighbouring settlements. By dawn, fresh warriors descend upon the unsuspecting Greeks. A fierce battle erupts along the shoreline. Odysseus and his men manage to fight their way back to the ships, but not before suffering painful losses. Several companions fall from every vessel. The voyage home has barely begun, and already the price is heavy. No sooner have they escaped than Zeus sends violent winds across the sea. Massive storms scatter the fleet, driving them far from the familiar waters of Greece. Days become weeks as landmarks disappear beyond the horizon. Eventually they reach a peaceful-looking shore inhabited by the mysterious lotus eaters. The people offer them a sweet fruit unlike anything the Greeks have ever tasted. Any man who eats it immediately loses all desire to return home. Memories of family, duty, and Ithaca simply fade away, Replaced by perfect contentment, some of Odysseus's sailors gladly accept the gift. Odysseus refuses. Realizing the danger, he drags his enchanted companions back to the ships by force, orders them tied beneath the rowing benches, and commands the fleet to sail away without delay. It is a harsh decision, but a necessary one. Sometimes the greatest threat is not a monster waiting in a cave, but the quiet temptation to abandon the journey altogether. As the ships disappear once more into the endless sea, neither Odysseus nor his crew can imagine that far greater dangers lie ahead. Their next destination will introduce them to a creature whose name will become legendary, a giant with one eye, enormous strength, and a father who happens to rule the oceans themselves. The encounter with the Lotus Eaters leaves Odysseus with an important lesson. Some dangers wear armour, while others simply smile and offer lunch. Unfortunately, the next island combines the worst qualities of both. As the fleet sails onward, a rugged coastline rises from the sea. Towering cliffs overlook rich green pastures where enormous flocks of sheep graze without shepherds in sight. Nearby lies another island, uninhabited but filled with wild goats, providing the Greeks with an easy feast after weeks at sea. Across the narrow channel lives a strange race known as the Cyclopes. These giants do not build cities. They have no kings, no laws, and no assemblies. Each Cyclops rules only his own household, caring little for neighbours or customs. To a Greek, this is almost more shocking than their single enormous eye. Civilization, after all, is measured by shared laws. The Cyclops simply do whatever they please. Curiosity gets the better of Odysseus. Rather than sail away, he selects 12 of his bravest companions and crosses to the mainland. He brings with him an especially strong wine, a gift once given by the priest Maron after the fall of Ismarus. Thick, sweet, and remarkably potent, it can be mixed with 20 parts water. Drinking it undiluted is generally considered an adventurous decision. The men soon discover a vast cave overflowing with cheese, milk, and wicker baskets filled with food. Massive pens hold hundreds of sheep and goats. Several of Odysseus's companions immediately suggest taking what they can and leaving before the owner returns. It is excellent advice. Odysseus ignores it. He wants to meet the cave's master, hoping to receive the sacred Greek custom of xenia, hospitality towards strangers. In the Greek world, travellers could expect food, shelter, and gifts before even stating their names. Zeus himself was believed to protect guests. The owner of the cave has never received that particular memo. As sunset falls, the ground begins to tremble beneath heavy footsteps. The Cyclops Polyphemus enters, driving his flock before him. He rolls an enormous boulder across the cave entrance, sealing it completely. The stone is so immense that 20 ordinary men could never hope to move it. Only then does the giant notice the unexpected visitors. He asks who they are. Odysseus politely explains that they are Greek sailors returning from Troy, and respectfully asks for hospitality under the protection of Zeus. Polyphemus laughs. To him, Zeus means nothing. The gods of civilized men hold no authority in his lonely cave. Without another word, he seizes 2 Greeks as easily as a child picking up dolls. Before the horrified survivors can react, he smashes them against the rocks and devours them raw. Bones crack. Blood stains the cave floor. Then, after finishing his gruesome meal, the giant stretches out among his sheep and calmly falls asleep. Panic grips the remaining men. Odysseus briefly considers driving his sword into the sleeping monster's heart. The opportunity is there. One swift strike would end the nightmare. But another problem quickly becomes obvious. If Polyphemus dies, No one inside the cave is strong enough to move the gigantic stone blocking the entrance. Killing the Cyclops now would simply turn the cave into a tomb. For perhaps the first time on this voyage, Odysseus realizes that surviving will require something even sharper than his sword. It will require the very quality that made him famous at Troy, his mind. As dawn breaks over the island, Polyphemus rises as though nothing unusual has happened. To him, yesterday's dinner was perfectly ordinary. He casually grabs 2 more of Odysseus's companions, kills them, and eats them before leading his sheep out to pasture. Once again, he seals the cave with the massive boulder, leaving the remaining Greeks trapped inside. The situation appears hopeless. Odysseus cannot overpower the giant. He cannot move the stone. Waiting patiently only guarantees that everyone will eventually become breakfast, lunch, or dinner. If there is to be any escape, it must come through deception. Fortunately, deception happens to be Odysseus's favourite profession. He notices a gigantic olive tree trunk lying inside the cave. The Cyclops has been drying it to use as a walking staff. Odysseus immediately sees another purpose. He and his companions cut a section from the trunk, sharpen one end into a point, and harden it in the fire before hiding it beneath piles of animal dung. It is an unpleasant hiding place, but one no Cyclops is likely to inspect too closely. That evening, Polyphemus returns. The giant repeats his dreadful routine, devouring 2 more unfortunate Greeks before settling down among his flock. Only then does Odysseus step forward, carrying the powerful wine he received from Maron. He offers it as a gift. Polyphemus has never tasted anything like it. The rich wine delights him, and he eagerly drinks cup after cup without adding water. For an ordinary Greek, this would already be reckless. For a creature the size of a small house, it is simply more alcohol. Soon the giant's speech begins to slur. Delighted with his guest's generosity, Polyphemus asks for the stranger's name so he can reward him. Odysseus smiles. "My name is Nobody." The answer seems ridiculous, but the drunken Cyclops accepts it without question. As a reward, he promises that nobody will be the very last person he eats. It is not exactly the gift Odysseus hoped for, but under the circumstances, surviving until dessert counts as progress. Moments later, Polyphemus collapses into a deep, drunken sleep. Odysseus gives the signal. Together, the surviving Greeks lift the sharpened olive stake, heat its tip until it glows red, and drive it with all their strength into the giant's single eye. The cave erupts with a scream so loud it echoes across the mountains. Blinded and roaring in agony, Polyphemus tears the stake from his eye while blood and smoke pour down his face. Other Cyclopes rush outside the cave and call out in concern. "What is wrong? Who is hurting you?" Still writhing in pain, Polyphemus bellows the only answer he can think of. "Nobody is killing me!" The other Cyclopes pause. If nobody is attacking him, then perhaps this is simply some illness sent by the gods. Shrugging, they return to their own caves, leaving Polyphemus completely alone. Odysseus' clever trick has worked perfectly. At first light, the blinded giant rolls away the entrance stone and feels the backs of every sheep as they leave for pasture, determined to catch the escaping Greeks. But Odysseus has anticipated even this. Each man clings beneath the thick wool of a ram, hidden from the Cyclops' searching hands. One by one, they pass safely into the sunlight. At last, Odysseus himself emerges beneath the largest ram of the flock. The Greeks race to their ship, cut the mooring lines, and row desperately away from shore. They have survived. They should simply keep rowing. Instead, once the ship is safely beyond the rocks, Odysseus cannot resist one final act of pride. He shouts back, mocking the blinded giant and boasting of his victory. When Polyphemus demands to know who defeated him, Odysseus proudly reveals his true name. "I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca." In that single moment, triumph becomes disaster. Polyphemus lifts his hands toward the sea and calls upon his father Poseidon, god of the oceans. He begs that Odysseus never reach home. Or, if fate insists that he does, let him arrive alone, after years of suffering, having lost every companion, only to find trouble waiting in his own house. Poseidon hears the prayer, and the sea begins to change. Leaving the island of the Cyclops behind, Odysseus carries more than battered ships and exhausted sailors. He now carries the anger of Poseidon himself, a burden no mortal would willingly choose. The sea seems quieter for a time, but beneath its calm surface the god's resentment waits patiently. Divine revenge, unlike fresh bread, keeps remarkably well. After several days, the fleet reaches the floating island of Aeolia, home of Aeolus, master of the winds. Unlike the savage Cyclops, Aeolus welcomes strangers according to the sacred customs of hospitality. He feasts Odysseus and eagerly listens to the incredible tale of Troy, the wooden horse, and the terrifying encounter with Polyphemus. For an entire month, the king and the wandering hero exchange stories. When it is finally time to leave, Aeolus offers Odysseus an extraordinary gift. He gathers every troublesome wind into a great leather bag made from the hide of an ox. North, south, east, and west are all trapped inside, tightly sealed with a shining silver cord. Only the gentle west wind remains free to guide the Greeks safely home. It is perhaps the greatest navigation system ever invented. Aeolus gives Odysseus one simple instruction: do not open the bag. Odysseus carefully stores it aboard his flagship and personally guards it throughout the voyage. For 9 straight days and nights he barely sleeps, steering the fleet toward Ithaca. Then, at last, the impossible happens. The coastline of home appears on the horizon. The mountains of Ithaca rise from the sea. Smoke curls from distant villages. Odysseus is so close that he can almost imagine embracing Penelope and meeting the son who has grown into a man. After 9 sleepless days, exhaustion finally defeats him. He closes his eyes. That is all the opportunity his crew needs. The sailors have spent days whispering among themselves. They cannot understand why Odysseus protects the mysterious leather bag so carefully. Surely, they reason, it must contain gold, silver, or priceless treasures secretly given to their king. Apparently, after surviving witches, monsters, and cannibal giants, they still have not learned that curiosity is rarely profitable. As Odysseus sleeps, they untie the silver cord. Instantly, every imprisoned wind explodes into the open sea. The ships are hurled in every direction. Towering waves swallow the fleet as a furious hurricane drives them away from Ithaca. By the time Odysseus awakens, his homeland has completely vanished behind the storm. The men have quite literally blown away their chance to go home. With no other choice, they return to Aeolia. Odysseus hopes Aeolus will simply gather the winds again. Instead, the ruler of the winds looks upon the broken fleet with horror. He assumes only one explanation is possible. No ordinary man could suffer such astonishing misfortune unless the gods themselves hated him. Believing Odysseus has become cursed beyond help, Aeolus refuses another gift and orders the Greeks to leave his island forever. Once again, they sail into the unknown. Soon they reach the land of the Laestrygonians, a race of enormous giants far more dangerous than even the Cyclopes because they live together instead of alone. The harbour appears calm and sheltered, surrounded by towering cliffs. Every Greek captain eagerly rows inside, believing they have found a safe place to anchor. Only Odysseus hesitates. Trusting his instincts, he leaves his own ship outside the narrow entrance. It is the decision that saves his life. The welcoming harbour is a trap. Within moments, the giants begin hurling massive boulders from the cliffs, smashing ships like children's toys. Others seize sailors with their bare hands, carrying the screaming men away to be eaten. Panic spreads through the fleet. The narrow entrance that promised safety now becomes a deadly bottleneck from which almost no one can escape. Only Odysseus's single ship, waiting outside the harbour, manages to cut its ropes and flee into the open sea. 11 ships are destroyed. Hundreds of loyal companions are gone. The proud fleet that left Troy with 12 vessels now consists of just one lonely ship, sailing toward an island where an enchantress named Circe is already waiting. Only one ship remains. Of the 12 proud vessels that sailed away from Troy, 11 now rest at the bottom of the sea, or lie shattered along the shore of the Laestrygonians. The survivors are exhausted, grieving, and beginning to wonder whether Poseidon intends to hunt them forever. After days of drifting, a heavily forested island appears on the horizon. Smoke rises gently above the trees, suggesting that someone, or something, lives there. This is Aiaia, home of the enchantress Circe. Odysseus divides his remaining crew into 2 groups. One stays behind to guard the ship, while the other, led by his trusted companion Eurylochus, explores the island in search of food and fresh water. Before long, they discover a magnificent stone palace surrounded by tame wolves and lions. Surprisingly, the animals do not attack. Instead, they wag their tails like loyal dogs greeting old friends. To any sensible traveller, this is an excellent moment to turn around immediately. Instead, the sailors knock on the door. Circe welcomes them warmly. She smiles, invites them inside, prepares a lavish meal of cheese, barley, honey and wine, and speaks with perfect kindness. The weary Greeks gladly accept her hospitality, believing that perhaps, at long last, fortune has begun to favour them. Only Eurylochus hesitates. Something feels wrong. He remains outside while the others feast. His caution proves wise. Hidden within the food is a powerful enchantment. The moment the sailors finish eating, Circe touches each one with her golden wand. Instantly, their bodies begin to change. Hands become hooves. Faces stretch into snouts. Voices dissolve into frightened squeals. Within moments, the proud veterans of Troy have become pigs. Their minds remain human, fully aware of the nightmare, but their bodies obey only their new animal forms. Circe calmly herds them into a sty and tosses them acorns for dinner. Eurylochus runs back to the beach in terror. He tells Odysseus everything. For perhaps the first time since leaving Troy, even Odysseus pauses. Fighting a giant is one thing. Fighting a woman who can turn soldiers into livestock is another entirely. Nevertheless, he refuses to abandon his companions. Alone, he climbs towards Circe's palace. Along the forest path, another immortal suddenly appears. Hermes, the swift messenger of the gods, has come to help. The young god hands Odysseus a rare magical herb called moly, its black root and white flower able to resist Circe's spells. He explains exactly what will happen. Circe will offer food. Accept it. She will strike with her wand. The spell will fail. Then draw your sword. Do not kill her, Hermes warns, but force her to swear an oath by the river Styx that she will do no further harm. Odysseus follows every instruction. Everything unfolds exactly as Hermes predicted. Circe serves the enchanted meal. Odysseus eats without fear. She touches him with her wand. Nothing happens. For the first time in countless years, her magic has failed. Startled, Circe barely has time to react before Odysseus draws his bronze sword and advances. The mighty enchantress, who moments earlier had transformed seasoned warriors into pigs without effort, suddenly finds herself begging for mercy. Keeping her oath, Circe immediately restores every sailor to human form. More remarkably still, she makes them younger, stronger, and healthier than before. The scars of war seem lighter, and hope briefly returns to the weary crew. What begins as a dangerous confrontation slowly becomes friendship. 1 month passes, then another. Before anyone notices, an entire year has slipped away in comfort. The men feast every day, sleep in warm beds, and forget the hardships of the sea. Eventually, it is the crew, not Odysseus, who remind their king why they came. Home still waits. Circe agrees to help them leave, but first she reveals a terrifying truth. If Odysseus wishes to reach Ithaca, he must sail somewhere no living man willingly goes. Before he can find the road home, he must first seek guidance from the dead themselves. Circe's final instructions are unlike anything Odysseus has ever heard. To find the road home, he must first sail to the edge of the world, beyond the lands of ordinary men, beyond the reach of the sun's familiar path, to the gloomy kingdom ruled by Hades and Persephone. There, among the countless spirits of the dead, he must seek the blind prophet Tiresias, whose wisdom remains untouched even after death. It is an unsettling assignment. Most heroes spend their lives trying to avoid the underworld. Odysseus is being told to visit it on purpose. Following Circe's directions, the lone Greek ship crosses a silent sea until it reaches the land of the Cimmerians, a mysterious people said to live beneath endless mist. Here, sunlight barely penetrates the heavy clouds. The landscape seems trapped in permanent twilight, as though even dawn hesitates to enter. Odysseus and his companions step ashore. Using his bronze sword, he digs a deep trench in the earth exactly as Circe instructed. Into it he pours offerings of milk, honey, sweet wine, fresh water, and barley. Finally, he sacrifices black sheep, allowing their blood to flow into the pit. Almost immediately, shadows begin to gather. Thousands of restless spirits emerge from the darkness. Young and old, kings and beggars, warriors and children, the dead press eagerly toward the blood, for it briefly restores their memories and voices. Terrified, Odysseus draws his sword and keeps every spirit away until Tiresias arrives. But before the prophet appears, another familiar figure approaches. It is Elpenor, one of Odysseus's own sailors. The young man had become drunk during the final night on Circe's island, fallen asleep on the palace roof, and upon waking suddenly, forgotten where he was. He stepped forward, lost his footing, and fell to his death. It is perhaps the least heroic death in all of Greek mythology. His ghost begs Odysseus to return later and give him a proper burial. Without funeral rites, his soul cannot find peace. Odysseus solemnly promises that he will. Before leaving Circe's island for the second time, the enchantress offers Odysseus one final series of warnings. The journey ahead cannot be completed without sacrifice. Some dangers can be avoided, others must simply be endured. The first threat is the sirens, mysterious creatures whose voices are so beautiful that no sailor who hears them ever wishes to leave. Drawn toward the irresistible music, ships crash upon hidden rocks, leaving only broken hulls and silent bones scattered along the shore. Circe gives precise instructions. Every sailor must seal his ears with softened beeswax. Odysseus, however, cannot resist the opportunity to hear the legendary song. He orders his men to tie him tightly to the ship's mast. No matter what happens, they must ignore every command he gives until the danger has passed. Soon, the haunting melody drifts across the water. The sirens do not sing of riches or power. Instead, they promise knowledge. They claim to know everything that happened at Troy, every secret in the world, every mystery hidden from mankind. Their voices seem to understand every curiosity buried inside the human mind. Odysseus struggles violently against the ropes. He begs. He shouts. He orders the crew to untie him immediately. The sailors only tighten the knots and continue rowing. Eventually, the music fades into the distance. For the first time, a ship has sailed safely past the sirens. Unfortunately, the next obstacle offers no clever solution. Ahead lies a narrow strait. On one side waits Charybdis, a monstrous whirlpool that swallows enormous quantities of seawater 3 times each day before violently spitting it back into the sea. Any ship caught within its pull is doomed. Opposite the whirlpool lives Scylla. She is an even greater nightmare. Hidden inside a cave high above the cliffs, Scylla possesses 12 legs, 6 impossibly long necks, and 6 terrible heads lined with rows of razor-sharp teeth. Whenever a ship passes beneath her cave, each head snatches a sailor before anyone can react. Circe's advice is grim. Sail close to Scylla, lose 6 men. Better 6 than everyone. No captain ever wishes to choose which of his companions will die. Odysseus tries to keep the truth from his crew, hoping to spare them panic. As the ship enters the narrow passage, towering cliffs close around them. Everyone watches the terrifying whirlpool below, where the sea churns into a roaring black funnel. No one looks up. That is exactly what Scylla is waiting for. Without warning, 6 enormous heads strike from the darkness. 6 sailors are lifted screaming into the air. Odysseus reaches for his spear, but the attack is over before he can react. He later admits it is the most helpless moment of his entire voyage. There was simply nothing he could do. The survivors row onward in stunned silence. Soon another island appears, peaceful and green beneath the warm Mediterranean sun. Grazing across its meadows are magnificent cattle belonging to Helios, the sun god. Odysseus immediately remembers Tiresias's warning. No one must touch them. The crew reluctantly agrees. Then disaster intervenes. For an entire month, fierce storms trap the ship on the island. Supplies disappear. Hunger grows unbearable. While Odysseus climbs a hillside to pray for help, exhaustion overtakes him and he falls asleep. His men see their chance. Led by Eurylochus, they slaughter the sacred cattle. They convince themselves that angry gods are preferable to starving stomachs. After all, they reason, a hungry man cannot enjoy tomorrow's punishment. It is understandable logic. It is also catastrophically wrong. When Odysseus awakens and sees the feast already cooking over the fire, he knows instantly that the prophecy has begun. The crew has not merely broken a rule. They have sealed their fate. And somewhere above the clouds, Helios is already demanding justice from Zeus. The moment Odysseus and his men leave the island of Helios, Zeus acts. Dark clouds gather over the sea with terrifying speed. Thunder rolls across the sky as if Olympus itself has declared war on a single ship. Then comes the lightning. A blazing bolt crashes into the mast. The vessel explodes into splintered wood. Sails burst into flames. oars snap like twigs. Within moments, the last surviving ship from Troy is nothing more than drifting wreckage. Every one of Odysseus's remaining companions is thrown into the sea. The prophecy of Tiresias is fulfilled. One after another, the sailors disappear beneath the waves. Odysseus alone survives. Clinging desperately to a broken mast, he is carried helplessly across the open sea. For 9 endless days he drifts wherever the currents choose to take him. Once again, he passes the deadly whirlpool of Charybdis, narrowly escaping being swallowed into its depths before the sea spits him back into open water. At last, the exhausted king washes ashore on the hidden island of Ogygia. It is a place unlike any he has ever seen. Flowers bloom throughout every season. Crystal springs flow through green forests, birds sing constantly, and no sign of age or hardship exists anywhere. Here lives the immortal nymph Calypso. She rescues the nearly lifeless Odysseus, nurses his wounds, and offers him everything a weary traveller could desire. Warm food, soft clothing, peaceful days, and freedom from every danger that has haunted him since Troy. Then she offers something even greater, immortality. If Odysseus remains with her as her husband, he will never grow old, never become weak, and never die. For many men, the decision would take perhaps 3 seconds. Odysseus refuses, not immediately. 7 long years pass on Ogygia. Although Calypso treats him kindly, his heart never truly belongs there. Every evening he walks to the shore, sits upon the rocks, and gazes across the endless sea toward a homeland he cannot see. He longs not for eternal life, but for Penelope, Telemachus, and the small rocky island where he was born. Far above, Athena has grown increasingly frustrated. Her favourite hero has suffered enough. She appears before Zeus and argues that Odysseus has paid more than enough for his mistakes. The king of the gods finally agrees. Hermes is sent to Ogygia with a direct command. Calypso must let Odysseus go. The nymph obeys, though not happily. She helps him build a sturdy raft, provides food, fresh water, clothing, and favourable supplies for the journey ahead. After wishing him well, she watches him disappear over the horizon. For 17 peaceful days, Odysseus sails alone. Then Poseidon returns from visiting distant lands. The sea god immediately spots the tiny raft. His anger has not faded in the slightest. With a single gesture, he unleashes another devastating storm. Towering waves smash the raft to pieces. Odysseus is hurled back into the sea, fighting simply to breathe. Only through the help of the sea goddess Ino, who gives him a magical veil to keep him afloat, and Athena, who calms the winds at the final moment, does he survive. Half dead, he reaches the island of Scheria, home of the Phaeacians. There he is discovered by Princess Nausicaa, who treats the mysterious stranger with kindness and leads him to her parents' palace. King Alcinous welcomes Odysseus according to the sacred laws of hospitality. During a great feast, the wandering king finally reveals his identity and recounts every adventure from Troy to the Cyclops, from Circe to the underworld, from the sirens to Calypso. The Phaeacians listen in astonishment. Then, honouring both guest and hero, they do what no storm, monster, or god has allowed for 20 long years. They carry Odysseus home. While he sleeps peacefully aboard their swift black ship, the coastline of Ithaca finally rises from the morning mist. When the Phaeacian ship quietly reaches the shores of Ithaca, the sailors gently carry the sleeping Odysseus onto the beach. Beside him, they leave magnificent gifts of gold, bronze, fine clothing, and precious treasures before silently sailing away. After 20 years, The king is finally home. He simply doesn't recognize it. Athena has wrapped the island in a magical mist to protect him from enemies. As Odysseus awakens, he looks around in confusion. The coastline seems unfamiliar. For one heartbreaking moment, he believes the Phaeacians have betrayed him and abandoned him on yet another strange shore. Then a young shepherd approaches. At least, that is what he appears to be. The shepherd is actually Athena in disguise. The goddess smiles as Odysseus immediately invents an elaborate false story about who he is and why he has arrived. Even after 20 years of hardship, he cannot resist testing strangers with clever lies. Athena laughs and reveals her true identity. "Only you," she tells him, "would lie to a goddess while standing in your own homeland." The mist disappears. The mountains, olive groves, and rocky hills of Ithaca emerge before his eyes. At last, he kneels and kisses the soil of his homeland. But there is no time for celebration. Athena explains that his palace has become occupied by more than 100 arrogant noblemen known as the suitors. Believing Odysseus long dead, they feast every day at his expense, slaughter his livestock, drink his wine, and compete to marry Penelope so one of them can seize the throne. Penelope refuses them all. Each day she promises to choose a husband once she finishes weaving a funeral shroud for Odysseus's elderly father, Laertes. Each night she secretly unravels everything she has woven. For 3 years she successfully deceives them. Eventually, however, one of her servants reveals the trick. Meanwhile, Odysseus's son, Telemachus, has grown into a thoughtful young man. Encouraged by Athena, he recently travelled to visit King Nestor and King Menelaus, hoping to learn whether his father might still be alive. Now, he too is sailing home. Athena knows father and son must reunite before confronting the suitors. First, however, Odysseus must disappear. With a touch of her staff, Athena transforms him into an old beggar. His skin wrinkles, his shoulders stoop, his hair becomes grey, and his fine clothing changes into dirty rags. Even those who once knew him best would never recognize the mighty king. His first destination is not the palace. It is the humble farm of Eumaeus, his loyal swineherd. Unlike many servants, Eumaeus has remained completely faithful throughout Odysseus's long absence. He welcomes the disguised stranger with warmth, offering simple food, shelter, and conversation, despite believing him to be nothing more than a wandering beggar. Hospitality, even toward the poorest traveller, remains one of the highest Greek virtues. That very evening, Telemachus returns safely to Ithaca and arrives at Eumaeus's farm. Father and son stand only a few steps apart. Neither realizes who the other truly is. When Eumaeus briefly leaves the hut, Athena appears once again. She restores Odysseus to his true appearance, making him younger, taller, and unmistakably kingly. Telemachus stares in disbelief. At first he thinks a god has appeared before him. Only after Odysseus embraces him and speaks through tears does the truth finally sink in. For the first time in 20 years, father and son stand together. Their reunion is brief but deeply moving. There will be time for tears later. First, they must reclaim a kingdom. The plan is finally ready. Odysseus remains disguised as an old beggar, while Telemachus quietly prepares the palace from within. Together, father and son study every doorway, every hallway, and every possible escape route. They count the loyal servants who can be trusted and identify those who have betrayed their king. The odds are almost laughable. 2 men against more than 100 armed suitors. Then again, the suitors have spent the last several years becoming experts in eating, drinking, and insulting old beggars. Military preparation has not been high on their list of priorities. Odysseus enters his own palace unnoticed. The sight before him is painful. The great hall echoes with laughter as the suitors devour his cattle, empty his wine jars, and gamble away the afternoons. Musicians play while servants hurry from table to table. It resembles a royal feast, except the king has been replaced by freeloaders with remarkably healthy appetites. Several suitors mock the ragged stranger. One throws a stool at him. Another laughs at his worn clothing. Only a few servants show kindness, among them the faithful nurse Eurycleia. While washing the beggar's feet, she notices an old scar on his leg, received decades earlier during a boar hunt as a young prince. She immediately recognizes him. Odysseus gently places a hand over her mouth and begs her to remain silent. The time has not yet come. Meanwhile, Penelope enters the great hall. After 20 years of waiting, she announces that she will finally choose a husband, but only after one final contest. She orders Odysseus' great bow to be brought from storage. It is an enormous weapon that only its owner ever possessed the strength to string. The challenge is simple. Whoever can string the bow and fire an arrow cleanly through 12 aligned axe heads will win her hand. One by one, the suitors step forward. They pull, they strain, they sweat. Some even warm the bow over the fire or rub it with oil, hoping to soften the wood. Nothing works. The bow refuses to bend. The proud warriors who have boasted for years cannot even string the weapon belonging to the man whose throne they are trying to steal. Then the old beggar quietly asks for a turn. The hall erupts in laughter. Some shout that he will break the priceless bow. Others insist he should be thrown outside immediately. Penelope, however, agrees. Telemachus orders the bow placed into the stranger's hands. The room falls strangely quiet. Odysseus examines the weapon lovingly, almost as if greeting an old friend after many years apart. Then, with effortless ease, he strings it in a single smooth motion. The bowstring sings like the clear note of a lyre. A silence settles over the palace. Every smile disappears. Odysseus picks up an arrow. He draws the string to its full length. The arrow flashes through the air, passing perfectly through all 12 axe heads without touching a single one. At that very instant, Athena lifts the last traces of uncertainty from the room. The beggar stands taller. His eyes burn with determination. The king has returned. Without hesitation, Odysseus knocks a second arrow. Its target is Antinous, the most arrogant of the suitors, who is lifting a golden cup to his lips. The arrow strikes him cleanly through the throat. The cup falls from his hand. Wine spills across the floor as the first of the usurpers collapses. Panic sweeps through the hall. The suitors scramble for weapons, only to discover that Telemachus has already removed nearly all of them. The trap they believed they had set for an old beggar has quietly become one set for themselves. The battle for Ithaca has begun. The great hall erupts into chaos. The suitors, moments earlier laughing over their feast, now scramble in blind panic. Antinous lies dead on the floor, and for a heartbeat no one understands what has happened. Some believe the arrow was an accident. Then Odysseus speaks. His voice fills the palace with the authority of a king who has finally come home. "You dogs," he declares. "You believed I would never return from Troy. You consumed my wealth, harassed my wife, and dishonoured my house. Now your reckoning has come." There is no longer any doubt. The beggar is gone. The king of Ithaca stands before them. One of the suitors, Eurymachus, desperately tries to negotiate. He blames everything on the dead Antinous and promises that they will repay every stolen animal, every cup of wine, and every piece of treasure. Gold, silver, cattle, whatever Odysseus demands. It is far too late. Some crimes cannot be balanced with payment. Odysseus releases another arrow. Eurymachus falls. the battle begins in earnest. Telemachus, the loyal swineherd Eumaeus, and the faithful cowherd Philoetius fight beside their king. Athena watches over them, appearing at times in the form of mentor to strengthen their courage. Although badly outnumbered, the defenders possess two advantages the suitors no longer have: discipline and purpose. The palace becomes a battlefield. Spears crash against shields. Arrows whistle through the smoky hall. One by one, the suitors fall until none remain alive. Only the court singer and the palace herald are spared, for they had served unwillingly and committed no crimes against the household. Justice, in the eyes of ancient Greece, has been carried out. When the fighting finally ends, silence settles over the palace for the first time in many years, yet one final reunion remains. Penelope has heard the news, but she refuses to celebrate immediately. 20 years have passed. Stories spread easily. Tricks are common. She needs proof that this truly is her husband. She orders a servant to move their marriage bed into another room. Odysseus immediately objects. The bed cannot be moved. Long ago he built it himself around the trunk of a living olive tree, whose roots still stand beneath the palace floor. The room was constructed around that tree, making the bed impossible to remove without cutting down the trunk itself. Only Odysseus could know that secret. At last, Penelope's doubts vanish. She embraces him, and after 2 decades of separation, husband and wife are finally reunited. The following day, Odysseus travels to the countryside to embrace his aging father, Laertes, who had long believed his son dead. Though grief has made the old king frail, joy briefly restores his strength. Soon afterward, the families of the slain suitors gather, demanding revenge. A new civil war threatens to begin. Before more blood can be spilled, Athena intervenes. At Zeus's command, she orders both sides to lay down their weapons and swear lasting peace. Reluctantly, they obey. And so ends the Odyssey, not merely as the tale of a man returning home, but as a story about endurance, wisdom, loyalty, and hope. Odysseus defeats monsters, outwits gods, and crosses the very land of the dead, but his greatest victory is far simpler. After 20 years of wandering, he finally walks through his own front door. It is a reminder that the longest journeys are often measured not in miles sailed, but in the determination to keep going until home is found. The sea had finally released the man it had spent 10 long years trying to keep. Far behind him, the lush island of Ogygia faded into the morning mist, its forests glowing beneath the first light of dawn. Somewhere upon those distant cliffs stood Calypso, the immortal nymph who had loved Odysseus enough to imprison him with comfort instead of chains. The gods had ordered her to let him go, and for the first time in years, the king of Ithaca was once again sailing toward home. Or so everyone believed. Along the rocky northern coast of Ithaca, where fishermen measured wealth by the strength of their nets, rather than the size of their homes, a young man named Lycon watched the horizon with unusual fascination. He was barely 20 summers old, broad-shouldered from hauling nets since childhood, and possessed the dangerous quality common among young men who had never travelled farther than the next island. He believed stories, not merely listened to them, believed them. The old sailors gathered each evening beside driftwood fires, spoke endlessly of Odysseus. They described the clever king who had blinded the cyclops, outwitted the sirens, escaped the witch Circe, and survived storms sent by Poseidon himself. Every tale grew larger each year, until Odysseus seemed less like a man and more like someone who simply refused to accept the ordinary rules of the world. Lycon adored every word. While older fishermen nodded politely before returning to discussions about weather and broken oars, Lycan imagined something else entirely. If one man could survive monsters, perhaps monsters guarded places no ordinary sailor had ever reached. If Odysseus had crossed impossible seas, perhaps those seas concealed forgotten kingdoms overflowing with gold, ancient knowledge, or treasures abandoned by the Titans themselves. Heroes, Lycan reasoned, never returned empty-handed. His father disagreed. "The sea already gives us enough," the old fisherman often said while repairing torn nets. "The moment you ask it for more than fish, it starts asking for payment." Lycan always smiled politely. He also ignored every word. When rumours spread that Odysseus had finally left Ogygia, nearly everyone celebrated. Wives thanked the gods. Elders prepared offerings. Children practiced the king's name as though welcoming a legend back into history. Only Lycan noticed something strange. The ship did not seem to be sailing directly toward Ithaca. Each morning, from the cliffs overlooking the sea, Lycan studied the tiny sail moving across the distant water. He borrowed an old bronze spy mirror from a merchant, using reflected sunlight to track the vessel's position. Day after day, the course drifted farther south than any experienced sailor would choose. It made no sense. Every fisherman knew the shortest route home. Odysseus certainly did. Unless he wasn't taking the shortest route. Unless the greatest sailor alive knew of hidden passages, secret islands, or forgotten waters that ordinary men could never find. The thought rooted itself in Lycan's mind like an olive tree splitting stone. He barely slept that night. Before dawn painted the eastern sky, he quietly loaded his small fishing boat with fresh water, dried figs, salted fish, spare sails, rope, and his father's oldest bronze knife. He left behind only a short note. Gone fishing. It was not entirely a lie. Pushing his boat silently away from the shore, Lycan kept his eyes fixed upon the tiny silhouette of Odysseus far ahead. The distance between them remained great enough to avoid notice, yet close enough that he could follow the same general heading. He grinned as the morning wind filled his sail. He believed he was chasing the greatest adventure ever told. He had no idea that Odysseus wasn't leading anyone toward glory. He was quietly steering around places so terrible that even the songs had forgotten their names. The first day at sea felt almost disappointingly ordinary. The wind behaved as expected. Gulls circled overhead, hoping for scraps. Flying fish skipped across the waves like polished silver stones. Far ahead, Odysseus's dark sail remained just visible against the morning sky, never drawing closer, never completely disappearing. Lycan congratulated himself on keeping the perfect distance, close enough to follow, far enough to remain invisible. By sunset, he was certain his plan was working. On the second day, the sea began behaving strangely. It started with the birds. Hundreds of gulls had followed the coastline that morning, their cries filling the air. Then, almost at once, every bird turned north together. There was no predator, no storm, no obvious reason. They simply wheeled around in perfect silence and vanished toward Ithaca. Lycan frowned. Birds rarely abandoned open water unless something frightened them. He laughed to himself. Perhaps they're simply wiser than I am. The joke sounded less amusing after another hour passed without seeing a single feather. Then the dolphins disappeared. They had been racing alongside his little fishing boat since dawn, leaping effortlessly through the swells. Suddenly, the entire pod halted. Not gradually. Instantly. The sleek animals floated at an invisible line across the sea, clicking nervously. Their leader rose halfway from the water and stared toward the southern horizon. Then, as if obeying an order only they could hear, the dolphins turned around and swam away at full speed. Not one crossed that unseen boundary. Lycan slowly dipped his hand into the water. Nothing felt different. The sea remained calm. Too calm. Even the waves seemed quieter here, rolling without their usual rhythm, as though the ocean itself had decided not to make unnecessary noise. Far ahead, Odysseus never hesitated. His raft continued south with steady confidence. "He knows something," Lycan whispered. The thought excited him more than it frightened him. By the third morning, even the stars had become unfamiliar. Lycan had learned navigation from his father before he could properly row a boat. Every fisherman knew the constellations. The Great Bear pointed north. Orion marched across winter skies. The Pleiades guided sailors through the seasons, yet during the night, several stars had seemed wrong, not missing, simply misplaced. One bright star that should have risen near the eastern horizon appeared much farther west. Another seemed oddly dim, almost hidden behind nothing at all. He blamed exhaustion. That explanation comforted him until sunrise. The sun itself rose precisely where it should. Only the stars had wandered. Near midday, something enormous drifted across his path. At first, Lycan mistook it for a rocky islet. As he approached, he realized it was an ancient slab of black volcanic stone, almost perfectly flat, floating impossibly upon the sea. Weathered pillars still stood upon it, broken by centuries of wind. Half-submerged statues stared sightlessly toward the horizon. Most unsettling of all were the carvings. Words covered the stone in a language older than any inscription Lycan had ever seen. He could not read them, but someone had recently scratched a simple symbol beside the ancient writing, a circle, crossed by a single line. The same mark appeared again on another floating stone farther away, and another beyond that. They formed a trail. Lycan looked toward Odysseus. The king had already altered course, not dramatically, just enough to avoid sailing anywhere near the floating monuments. For the first time since leaving Ithaca, Lycan wondered whether the greatest hero in Greece was not searching for adventure. Perhaps he was carefully avoiding it. Still, curiosity proved stronger than caution. When the outline of a green island appeared through the afternoon mist, well east of Odysseus's new course, Lycan smiled. If Odysseus refused to visit it, then it was almost certainly worth exploring. The island looked almost welcoming. That alone should have made Lycan suspicious. After 3 uneasy days crossing increasingly silent waters, the sight of green hills, olive groves, and white marble buildings felt like a blessing sent by the gods. Gentle smoke drifted above the trees. Wildflowers covered the shoreline. A narrow harbour, protected by 2 graceful cliffs, invited ships to anchor as naturally as an open hand invites a handshake. Far out at sea, Odysseus never altered course. The king's small sail remained pointed west, deliberately giving the island a wide berth. Lycan shook his head. "Your loss." He lowered his own sail and rowed toward the harbour. The water was astonishingly clear. Schools of brightly coloured fish glided beneath his boat. Yet they moved strangely, never changing direction or speed. It was as though each fish repeated the exact same path over and over again. He leaned over the side. One silver fish swam beneath the boat. A moment later, the same fish appeared again, following the exact same route, every movement identical. Lycan blinked. Perhaps there were simply many fish that looked alike. That explanation satisfied him for almost an entire minute. Stepping onto the beach, he immediately noticed another oddity. There were footprints. Hundreds of them. Fresh footprints crossed the sand in every direction, leading toward the village beyond the dunes. None returned. The sea breeze carried the warm scent of fresh bread. His stomach answered before his mind could. Following the trail, Lycan climbed a gentle hill until neat rows of stone houses appeared among olive trees. The village was beautiful, cleaner than any settlement he had ever visited. Vines climbed white walls. Bronze lanterns hung beside every doorway. Water flowed from carved fountains into crystal-clear pools. But there were no people. Not a single voice. Not even a barking dog. A loaf of bread rested upon a wooden table outside one house. Steam still rose from it. Inside another home, a pot of lentils simmered gently above a fire that should have burned out hours ago. A cup of wine stood half full beside an open window. Someone had clearly been here. Recently. "Hello?" Lycan called. Only silence answered. He wandered farther into the empty streets. Then something impossible happened. The temple bell rang. Once, its deep bronze note echoed across the village. Lycan spun toward the sound. Nobody stood near the rope. The bell swayed gently on its own. Then, almost exactly 1 minute later, it rang again. The same tone, the same movement, the same echo. He waited. Another minute. Another identical bell. Not merely similar. Perfectly identical. Even the birds resting upon the temple roof lifted into the air in exactly the same pattern, before settling back onto the same stones. A chill crawled across his neck. The village was repeating itself. Trying to calm his nerves, Lycan looked toward the sky. The sun had not moved. Hours had passed since he landed. Yet the shadows remained exactly where they had been. He tested his growing fear by placing his father's bronze knife upright in the dirt beside the road. If time was truly passing, its shadow would slowly shift. He walked away. He counted to 100, then 200. When he returned, the knife's shadow had not moved the width of a fingernail. For the first time since leaving Ithaca, Lycan no longer thought about treasure. He thought about his boat, and whether he could still find it before whatever ruled this island noticed that time itself had begun paying attention to him. Lycan ran. The silent village no longer felt abandoned. It felt occupied by something that simply had no need to be seen. His sandals slapped against polished stone as he hurried back toward the harbour, using the bronze knife as a final reassurance. Surely the shadow would have moved by now. It had not. The blade stood exactly where he had left it, its shadow frozen like a painting carved into the earth. Then he noticed something worse. His own footprints had vanished. The dusty road behind him was perfectly smooth, as though he had never walked upon it. A breeze drifted through the olive trees. The leaves rustled. Exactly 1 minute later, they rustled again. Every branch bent in precisely the same direction. Every leaf trembled in precisely the same pattern. The island was not merely standing still, it was reliving the same minute over and over. Lycan forced himself onward. As he reached the edge of the village square, he heard footsteps. Real footsteps, not echoes. Slow, measured. Someone was walking toward him. Relief washed over him. Thank the gods! An old man emerged beneath a marble archway. His beard reached his waist, white as sea foam. His robes were woven from faded blue linen unlike any Lycan had ever seen. In one hand, He carried a long staff made from black wood polished smoother than glass. The old man stopped several paces away. His pale eyes settled upon Lycan, with neither surprise nor welcome. "You should not have followed the king." Lycan froze. You know Odysseus?" "I know why he never lands here." The old man's voice sounded ancient, like waves wearing away cliffs over countless generations. "You are trapped now." Lycan laughed nervously. "I can simply return to my boat." "No." The answer came without emotion. "You cross the boundary willingly." "What boundary?" The old man slowly pointed toward the sea beyond the harbour. "The one your dolphins refuse to cross." Lycan's smile disappeared. "How do you know about the dolphins?" "I have watched every visitor." The old man lowered his staff. "For 3,000 years." The number sounded absurd. No mortal lived that long. Yet nothing about this island obeyed ordinary rules anymore. "Who are you?" The old man considered the question for a long moment. "I no longer remember the name my mother gave me." He looked toward the motionless sun. "I have repeated this day so many times that names became unnecessary." A silence settled between them. Finally, Lycan asked the question that truly mattered. "Can I leave?" The old man did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the temple overlooking the village. Curiosity overcame fear once again. Lycan followed. Inside, there was no statue of Zeus, no image of Athena, no altar to Poseidon. The sanctuary was completely empty, except for a single enormous bronze wheel standing upright in the centre of the chamber. Hundreds of tiny symbols covered its surface. The wheel was turning, slowly, almost imperceptibly. Click, one notch, then silence. Exactly 1 minute later, click, another notch. The old man stared at it with exhausted eyes. "When this wheel completes one full revolution," he whispered, "time will move again." Lycan stepped closer. "How long has it been turning?" The old man's expression remained perfectly calm. "Since before the Trojan War." Lycan did the impossible calculation in his mind. The wheel had barely moved. Then the old man spoke the words that chilled him more than anything else he had seen. "It was much faster." He looked directly into Lycan's eyes, until something beneath the island began holding it back. Lycan could not stop staring at the bronze wheel. Its surface gleamed faintly in the dim light filtering through the temple roof, and with every painfully slow click, tiny clouds of ancient dust drifted from its gears. It was a magnificent piece of craftsmanship, far beyond anything he had ever seen in the workshops of Ithaca. No smith alive could have forged something so enormous with such impossible precision. "Who built it?" he asked quietly. The old man did not answer immediately. Instead, he placed a weathered hand upon the wheel, almost affectionately. "The gods merely inherited this place." Lycan frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly what I said." The old man's tired eyes never left the turning mechanism. Long before Zeus cast down Cronus, before the Titans ruled the heavens, before men learned to shape bronze, others governed the sea. Lycan felt an uneasy chill. He had heard priests insist that Zeus had always been king, that Olympus had always watched over mankind. The old man gave a faint smile. "Priests tell comforting stories." The smile disappeared. "The sea remembers older ones." For several moments neither man spoke. Then a deep vibration rolled beneath their feet. Not an earthquake. Something slower, heavier. The temple floor trembled once, stopped, then trembled again. The bronze wheel answered with a louder click than before. The old man closed his eyes. It is awake. What is? The reason this island was abandoned. Lycan instinctively reached for his knife. The old man almost laughed. Steel has no argument against something that existed before iron. Another vibration passed beneath the temple. This one lasted longer. Dust trickled from the ceiling. Outside, birds exploded from the olive trees all at once, circling frantically above the village before disappearing inland. For the first time since arriving, something had broken the island's endless repetition. The silence changed. Far below the temple came a sound unlike anything Lycan had ever heard. It resembled the groan of a mountain shifting beneath the sea, or perhaps a creature breathing in its sleep. The old man slowly turned toward the rear of the sanctuary. Hidden behind the wheel stood a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness. I prayed no one would ever come here again. You knew someone would? I knew curiosity would eventually defeat caution. He picked up his black staff. That is the oldest law of mankind. Lycan swallowed. We should leave. We cannot. Why not? Because once it fully wakes, the old man said softly, it will notice the living. Another rumble echoed upward. This time the air itself seemed warmer. A faint smell drifted from below. Not decay, not sulphur, salt. Ancient, stagnant seawater that had never seen the sun. The old man lit a small oil lamp hanging beside the staircase. Its flame flickered violently despite the still air. He hesitated for only a heartbeat before beginning his descent. After several steps, he looked back. Odysseus understood that some victories belong to wisdom, not courage. His voice echoed through the darkness. That is why he sailed away. Lycan stared toward the bright entrance of the temple. Beyond it lay his boat. Beyond that lay the open sea. He could still leave. He should leave. Instead, as every reckless hero before him had done, he tightened his grip upon his father's bronze knife and followed the old man into the depths beneath the island. Somewhere below, something enormous opened a single eye. The staircase descended far deeper than Lycan believed any island could possibly allow. Step after step disappeared into the earth, carved not by chisels, but by impossible precision. The walls were perfectly smooth, dark as polished obsidian, reflecting the glow of the old man's oil lamp in wavering patterns. The air grew colder for a time, then strangely warm, carrying the scent of ancient salt water that had remained trapped beneath stone for countless ages. Lycan expected to hear dripping water. Instead, there was only breathing. It was so deep and distant that at first he mistook it for the movement of the sea. But oceans do not inhale. Oceans do not exhale. Whatever rested below did both. The deeper they walked, the older everything seemed. The stone changed colour, becoming almost black, streaked with veins of pale silver that glowed faintly in the darkness. Strange symbols covered the walls, carved in circles instead of lines. They resembled no alphabet Lycan had ever seen. Looking at them for too long made his eyes ache, as though his mind refused to understand their shape. Scattered along the passage lay broken objects half buried beneath centuries of dust. A bronze helmet unlike any worn by Mycenaean warriors. Fragments of enormous anchors made from green stone. A shattered spear longer than the mast of Lycan's fishing boat. These were not relics left by ordinary sailors. Whoever had carried such weapons had been far larger than any man. The old guardian continued forward without hesitation. His pace suggested he had walked this path many times before, though each step carried the exhaustion of someone performing a duty that should have ended generations ago. Eventually, the staircase opened into an immense cavern. Lycan stopped breathing. The chamber was larger than many harbours. Its ceiling disappeared into darkness, supported by towering columns that looked less like architecture and more like the ribs of some unimaginably large creature turned to stone. A vast underground sea stretched beyond them, its black surface perfectly still, reflecting the faint silver glow of the cavern walls. In the centre rose a circular platform connected to the shore by a narrow stone bridge. Upon the platform stood dozens of colossal chains. Each link was thicker than an oak tree. Every chain descended into the black water. Most remained tight. One hung loose. Fresh cracks split the stone where it had once been anchored. Lycan slowly realized the terrible truth. The wheel in the temple had never been controlling time. It had been tightening these chains. Each slow turn above had kept something below from breaking free. Now the mechanism was failing. Another slow breath echoed across the underground sea. The water rippled. Not from wind, not from falling stone. Something enormous had shifted beneath the surface. The ripple reached the platform, gently rocking the broken chain against the stone with a heavy metallic groan. Lycan looked into the black water. For a brief moment, far below the surface, he saw something larger than an island move beneath the darkness. Then a single eye opened. It was not the yellow eye of a beast or the glowing eye of a monster from children's stories. It looked ancient, intelligent, and far older than Olympus itself. The eye remained open for only a heartbeat. Then it vanished beneath the black water. For several long moments, nothing moved. The underground sea became perfectly still once again, smooth as polished glass. Only the broken chain continued to sway gently, scraping against the stone with a slow metallic groan that echoed throughout the cavern. Lycan realized he had stopped breathing. His heart pounded so loudly that it almost drowned out the silence surrounding them. 20 years is a very long time to wait for a man. Long enough for children to become adults. Long enough for olive trees to bear countless harvests. Long enough for neighbours to stop saying, "He will return soon," and begin whispering, "Perhaps he never will." For Penelope, Queen of Ithaca, those 20 years had passed one thread at a time. Each morning she descended into the great hall with the same quiet dignity she had shown since Odysseus sailed for Troy. Around her, more than 100 arrogant suitors laughed, feasted, drank her husband's wine, slaughtered his cattle, and competed to claim the throne that did not belong to them. They called themselves guests. In truth, they were vultures circling a kingdom that refused to admit its king might already be dead. Penelope gave them nothing. By daylight she sat before her enormous loom, weaving what she claimed would become a funeral shroud for Laertes, Odysseus's elderly father. The suitors admired her devotion, believing that once the cloth was finished, she would finally choose a new husband. They did not know the truth. Each night, after the palace had fallen silent, Penelope climbed the stairs, carrying only a small oil lamp. Alone beneath the moonlight, she patiently unravelled every thread she had woven during the day. 20 years had taught her many things. Strength rarely looked like strength. Sometimes it looked like patience. Sometimes it looked like silence. Sometimes it looked like a woman pulling apart her own work, so that tomorrow she could begin again. Only a handful of loyal servants knew the secret, and every sunrise the great tapestry appeared to grow just enough to satisfy the impatient nobles. Even so, Penelope felt the walls closing around her. The suitors had become bolder. Some openly argued over how the palace should be divided after her marriage. Others mocked Telemachus, no longer seeing him as the boy he once was, but not yet respecting him as the man he was becoming. Several had begun carrying swords inside the hall, ignoring every ancient custom of hospitality. Ithaca was slowly slipping away. One stormy evening, as thunder rolled across the island and rain battered the palace roof, an unexpected visitor arrived. She was an old woman, wrapped in a weathered grey cloak, leaning upon an ashwood staff, polished smooth by decades of travel. Her eyes were completely white, clouded by blindness, yet she walked through the palace without hesitation, as though she knew every corridor by memory. The guards tried to stop her. She simply spoke Penelope's name. Not her title, not queen, only her name. The sound carried such strange certainty that even the guards stepped aside. Penelope received the woman in a small chamber overlooking the sea, dismissing every servant before the visitor finally lowered her hood. Her face was deeply lined, but there was something unsettling about it. She seemed older than memory itself, as though she had witnessed generations rise and fall without ever leaving the same road. She did not ask for food. She did not ask for shelter. Instead, she spoke the words that shattered 20 years of certainty. "Your husband still lives." Penelope's heart stopped for a single breath. The old woman slowly tilted her head toward the dark sea beyond the window. "But understand this. He is not imprisoned by chains. He is imprisoned by a promise." The room fell silent except for the rain. The blind prophetess explained that before the Greek fleet had sailed for Troy, Odysseus had secretly sworn an oath upon an ancient shore to a forgotten power older than many of the Olympian gods. The bargain had guaranteed favourable winds for the first stage of the expedition, but every oath demanded payment. Troy had fallen. The debt had not. Now, 20 years later, Odysseus wandered the seas, not because he had lost his way, but because an ancient promise refused to let him find it. The old prophetess was gone before dawn. No servant remembered seeing her leave the palace. The guards at the gates insisted that no one had passed during the night. Even the footprints leading through the rain-soaked courtyard had disappeared beneath the morning sun. Only her words remained. He is imprisoned by a promise. For 3 days Penelope spoke of it to no one. She watched the suitors feast in the great hall, laughing over roasted lamb and imported wine, while servants carried away empty cups as though the palace already belonged to them. Their confidence had grown with every passing season. 20 years had convinced them that waiting was foolish and patience was weakness. Penelope knew better. She had defeated them for 2 decades without drawing a sword, but this was different. An oath could not be unravelled like cloth. Late each evening she climbed to the highest terrace overlooking the harbour. The sea was calm now, its endless blue stretching toward the horizon where Odysseus had vanished so many years before. She tried to dismiss the prophecy as another wandering mystic's tale, yet one detail refused to leave her thoughts. The woman had known about the oath. No songs mentioned such a promise. Not even Nestor or Menelaus, who had sailed beside Odysseus to Troy, had ever spoken of it. Someone had deliberately buried the truth. On the 4th night, Penelope entered the old royal archives beneath the palace. Dust-covered shelves filled with clay tablets, faded scrolls, and shipping records dating back generations. Most concerned taxes, harvests, or treaties with neighbouring islands. Yet hidden inside a cracked cedar chest, she discovered something unusual. It was not an official record. It was Odysseus's own journal. Before leaving for Troy, the young king had occasionally written brief observations about his travels and diplomatic visits across Greece. His handwriting was quick and practical, filled with sketches of coastlines and lists of supplies. Near the final pages, one sentence had been violently scratched out. The ink was faded, but not invisible. The priest demanded that I swear. Everything after those words had been scraped away with a knife. Penelope ran her fingers across the damaged parchment. Odysseus himself had destroyed the rest. Not accidentally. Deliberately. She closed the journal and finally reached a decision. If her husband could not return because of an oath, then waiting in Ithaca accomplished nothing. Someone would have to find where that promise had been made. The next morning she summoned Telemachus before sunrise. Her son listened in silence as she explained only part of the truth. She spoke of unfinished business, of secret investigations, and of the need to protect the kingdom while she travelled. She did not mention prophecies or forgotten gods. Some burdens belong to a mother alone. Telemachus did not argue. The uncertainty of childhood had vanished from his face. He stood now as a man, tall enough to wear his father's armour and wise enough to understand that difficult choices often arrived without explanation. Before noon, Penelope disappeared from the palace. The Queen of Ithaca did not leave through the front gates. Instead, a widowed merchant named Elara boarded a small trading vessel carrying dyed wool, olive oil, and pottery bound for the eastern Aegean. Her royal robes had been exchanged for simple linen. Her golden jewellery had vanished. Even her famous dark hair lay hidden beneath a traveller's veil. Only one thing remained unchanged. The sharp mind that had outwitted 100 suitors was now sailing toward enemies who had no idea whom they were about to underestimate. For the first week, Penelope's disguise held perfectly. The little merchant vessel stopped at fishing villages, quiet harbours, and bustling island markets where traders argued over amphorae of wine, sacks of grain, and bars of Cypriot copper. No one paid much attention to a widowed merchant travelling alone. That was precisely why Penelope had chosen the disguise. Queens attracted questions. Widows attracted sympathy. The captain believed she was journeying east to settle her late husband's debts. The crew accepted the story without hesitation. In the Greek world, grief was common enough that few people wished to investigate it further. Penelope spent her days listening rather than speaking. Sailors always talked. They argued about weather, exchanged rumours from distant ports, and repeated every strange tale they had heard over cups of watered wine. Most stories were clearly exaggerated, but hidden among them were fragments that caught her attention. Several captains mentioned ships disappearing near an isolated chain of islands. Others spoke of ancient shrines abandoned by their priests. One old navigator swore that certain coves still received offerings meant for gods whose names had long since been forgotten. Each rumour pointed farther east, toward waters Odysseus had once crossed on his way to Troy. On the 8th morning the wind died without warning. The sea became unnaturally smooth, leaving the merchant ship drifting beneath a cloudless sky. Even the gulls disappeared. The captain frowned toward the southern horizon. Dark shapes were approaching. Long, narrow ships. 3 of them. Their sails were black. Pirates. The crew rushed into motion, but there was little hope. The merchant vessel carried cargo, not soldiers. Its few spears were old, and most of the sailors had never fought outside drunken tavern brawls. Within the hour, grappling hooks crashed over the rails. The pirate ships pulled alongside with practised precision. Men armed with curved swords poured onto the deck. Their leader stepped aboard last. He was broad-shouldered, grey-bearded, and wore a bronze helmet decorated with faded horsehair. Unlike his crew, he smiled before speaking. His eyes swept calmly across the frightened merchants before stopping on Penelope. Not because she looked wealthy, because she remained perfectly calm. Everyone else had backed away. She had not moved. The pirate chief walked closer, studying her weathered travel clothes. Then his smile faded. There was something familiar about her posture. Not the posture of a merchant, the posture of someone accustomed to giving orders. He demanded every passenger identify themselves. One by one, they complied. When Penelope's turn came, she bowed her head slightly and repeated the story she had prepared before leaving Ithaca. A widow, a trader, travelling east alone. The pirate listened without interruption. Then he asked a single unexpected question. What side did your husband fight for at Troy? Several merchants looked confused. It seemed like an odd question. Penelope immediately understood it was a trap. A real widow would answer without thinking. A liar would hesitate. She did neither. Instead, she quietly replied that no woman who truly loved her husband ever cared which battle earned the scar that took him away. For the first time in years, the pirate chief laughed, not because she had answered correctly, because she had answered like Odysseus himself. A clever answer instead of a direct one. His expression slowly became thoughtful. He had once met the king of Ithaca, and suddenly he wanted to know why a woman who spoke exactly like Odysseus was sailing toward the forgotten eastern sea. The pirate chief did not order his men to search the ship. Instead, he ordered everyone to wait. The sea remained strangely calm as both crews stood watching their leader study the woman who claimed to be an ordinary widow. He walked slowly around Penelope, saying nothing. Years spent raiding merchant vessels had taught him that wealth often wore humble clothes, and clever people rarely introduced themselves honestly. Penelope met his gaze without challenge. Fear would invite suspicion. Confidence would invite questions. She settled for quiet patience. Finally, the pirate spoke. He had fought in the Trojan War himself, though not for either famous king. Like many sailors, he had sold his ship to whoever paid the better price. During those years he had crossed paths with countless commanders, but only one had answered impossible questions with impossible answers. Odysseus. The pirate smiled faintly. The woman standing before him reminded him of the king of Ithaca far more than she realized. Rather than threaten her, he offered a proposal. Far to the east lay an island sailors called Black Sail Island. No charts marked it. No merchants willingly landed there. An old woman lived among its cliffs, trading knowledge for prices few dared pay. Every captain who sailed those waters knew of her. Few ever returned with what they sought. If Penelope truly travelled in search of forgotten truths, that was where her journey would lead eventually. The pirate offered safe passage, not from kindness, from curiosity. He wanted to know why a lone widow was risking her life for secrets connected to the years before Troy. Penelope accepted. By sunset, the merchant vessel had altered course, sailing beside the pirate ships instead of fleeing from them. The arrangement puzzled both crews, but no one questioned their captains. 3 days later, jagged black cliffs emerged from the morning mist. The island looked as though fire had once consumed it. Dark volcanic rock rose straight from the sea without beaches or harbours. Hundreds of seabirds circled silently overhead, yet none landed upon the cliffs. At the summit stood the crumbling remains of an ancient temple older than any Greek city. The pirate ships refused to approach. Their captain lowered a single rowboat instead. He would take Penelope ashore himself. As they neared the rocks, she noticed hundreds of strange objects hanging from ropes tied to the cliffs. Bronze swords, broken shields, crowns, golden necklaces, children's toys carved from olive wood. Every offering had been left behind deliberately. Every gift had weathered years of wind and salt. No one had dared retrieve them. Near the water's edge sat a woman beside a small fire. She appeared impossibly old. Her grey hair reached the ground. Her hands were stained with herbs and ash. Without looking up, she calmly dropped another branch onto the flames. She already knew they had arrived. The pirate stopped rowing. His weathered face suddenly lost every trace of confidence. He refused to go any farther. Penelope stepped alone onto the black shore. The old woman slowly lifted her eyes. "They finally sent the wife," she said softly. Her voice carried no surprise, only relief, as though she had spent 20 years expecting this exact meeting. The old woman led Penelope away from the shore without another word. A narrow path climbed through the black volcanic cliffs, twisting between jagged rocks polished smooth by centuries of wind. Nothing grew there except pale grey moss clinging stubbornly to cracks in the stone. Even the seabirds remained silent now, circling far overhead as though unwilling to cross an invisible boundary. At the summit stood the ruined temple. Time had broken its columns and scattered enormous blocks of marble across the hill, yet the place still possessed an unsettling dignity. It had not been destroyed by war. It had simply been abandoned. The old woman stopped before a circular altar carved directly into the rock. Unlike every Greek temple Penelope had ever visited, there were no statues of Zeus or Athena, no carved owls, no thunderbolts, no tridents, only a single symbol repeated across the weathered stone, a circle surrounded by endless waves. The same symbol appeared upon the altar, upon the broken columns, and even upon the smooth floor beneath centuries of dust. Someone had once worshipped a power the Olympians had erased from memory. The old woman knelt and brushed sand away from the centre of the altar. A polished bronze disc appeared beneath it. Its surface reflected the afternoon sunlight with surprising clarity despite its great age. She motioned for Penelope to look. At first, the metal reflected only the sky. Then the image changed. The temple disappeared. Instead, Penelope found herself watching another day, another lifetime. The shoreline below the temple was crowded with ships preparing for war. Hundreds of warriors loaded shields, spears, and supplies, while priests burned incense along the beach. Among them stood a younger Odysseus. He looked scarcely older than Telemachus was now. His armour gleamed in the morning sun, and ambition filled his face far more than caution. Beside him stood 3 other kings whose faces the bronze refused to reveal. Only Odysseus remained clear. A priest wearing robes woven with silver thread approached the young king carrying a shallow bowl filled with seawater. Odysseus placed one hand into the bowl. The priest spoke words the bronze mirror refused to repeat. Then came the oath. Penelope watched her husband kneel before the ancient altar and swear that if the sea carried him safely to Troy, he would return before the 20th harvest after the city's fall. The waves themselves answered, not with thunder, not with lightning. The sea simply became perfectly still. The bargain had been accepted. The vision faded. Penelope stepped backward, her heartbeat echoing inside the silent ruins. The old woman slowly covered the bronze disc once more. "The war lasted longer than anyone expected," she said quietly. "The journey home lasted longer still." Penelope finally understood. Odysseus had not broken his promise willingly. Time itself had defeated him. But ancient oaths did not measure intention, only fulfillment. The old woman looked toward the endless sea beyond the cliffs. When the 20th year ended, the oath became a prison. Far below, a wave struck the black rocks with unusual force, then another. The calm sea surrounding the island had begun to change. Something had noticed that the Queen of Ithaca now knew the truth. The sea grew restless before the sky did. Standing atop the ruined temple, Penelope watched the water darken as though a shadow were spreading beneath its surface. There were no storm clouds overhead, yet the waves no longer rolled with their usual rhythm. They circled the island instead, turning slowly like a great wheel. The old woman wasted no time. She gathered a small leather satchel already waiting beside the altar, as if she had prepared for this moment years ago. Without looking back, she began descending the narrow path toward the shore. Penelope followed. Neither woman spoke. There was nothing left to explain. The truth had already been revealed. Odysseus had fulfilled every challenge the world placed before him, yet one forgotten promise continued to hold him. It was not chains, monsters, or distance keeping him from Ithaca. It was an agreement, older than memory. Halfway down the cliffs, Penelope noticed something strange. The offerings hanging from the rocks were moving. Not in the wind. There was no wind. The bronze swords, broken shields, necklaces, and ancient crowns all swayed gently toward the sea, as though pulled by an invisible current. One by one the old ropes snapped. The objects fell into the water below. None floated. Each disappeared beneath the surface without leaving so much as a ripple. The old woman glanced toward the horizon. The tribute has been accepted. Her voice remained calm, but her pace quickened. When they reached the shore, the pirate captain was already waiting beside his rowboat. His weathered face had lost every trace of confidence. He had spent his life fearing storms. This was something entirely different. The sea had become silent. No gulls circled overhead. No fish disturbed the water. Even the waves striking the cliffs made almost no sound. The captain crossed himself in the old sailor's fashion before pushing the boat into the water. The three of them had barely rowed 50 strokes from shore when the sea behind them began to glow. Not brightly. Just enough to reveal enormous shapes moving beneath the surface. At first, Penelope believed they were whales. Then one shadow rose closer. It was too large. Its smooth back stretched across the water longer than the pirate's entire ship. Pale blue markings shimmered beneath the surface, forming patterns that resembled ancient writing rather than natural markings. The creature never surfaced completely. It simply passed beneath them. The small boat rocked violently in its wake. Neither the pirate nor the old woman looked over the side. They kept rowing. Far ahead, the pirate ships had already raised every sail, desperate to leave the island behind. Then the sea opened. Not with an explosion, not with a towering wave. The water simply folded apart, revealing a vast circle of darkness beneath. From its centre emerged a woman's face. She was beautiful in the unsettling way statues are beautiful. Perfect. Expressionless. Her skin shimmered like moonlight upon deep water, and her hair flowed around her as though made from the sea itself. She was neither rising nor floating. She simply existed within the water, larger than any temple ever built by mortal hands. Her ancient eyes settled upon Penelope alone. There was no anger in them, only disappointment, as though she had expected Odysseus to come himself. Instead, his wife had arrived to break the bargain. The face remained upon the sea. The pirate captain immediately dropped to his knees inside the rocking boat, lowering his head until it nearly touched the planks. Beside him, the old woman bowed in silence, her weathered hands resting against the gunwale. Only Penelope remained standing. The water around the immense figure shimmered like polished silver beneath the afternoon sun. Her eyes held the stillness of the deepest ocean, untouched by time or emotion. She did not resemble Athena's wisdom or Hera's royal pride. There was something far older in her presence. She looked like the sea before mankind had ever learned to build ships. The silence stretched across the water. Then the goddess spoke. Her voice did not travel through the air. It echoed directly inside Penelope's thoughts, carrying the endless rhythm of waves striking forgotten shores. She reminded the queen that promises were the oldest law in existence. Kingdoms rose and fell, cities burned, kings died. But an oath willingly spoken remained unchanged. Odysseus had accepted favourable winds before sailing to Troy. The sea had kept its part of the bargain. Now it waited for his. Penelope listened without lowering her gaze. She understood the fairness of agreements. Ithaca itself depended upon laws being honoured. A ruler whose word meant nothing, ruled only until someone stronger arrived. Yet something about the bargain felt incomplete. The goddess had spoken only of duty, never of justice. Penelope slowly removed the gold wedding ring she had worn since her marriage, and held it between her fingers. It was the only piece of royal jewellery she had carried from Ithaca, not because of its value, because it represented a promise of its own. A marriage survived, not because both people fulfilled every expectation perfectly, but because neither abandoned the other when life refused to cooperate. The queen raised the ring toward the towering figure. A mortal could not outmatch a goddess. But perhaps she could outreason one. She calmly declared that every oath required two faithful partners. If one side changed the conditions beyond recognition, the agreement itself became broken. Odysseus had sworn to return before the 20th harvest. He had not wasted those years through laziness or betrayal. Gods, monsters, storms, enchantresses, and endless suffering had delayed him. The cave no longer smelled of blood. Years ago, sailors had spoken of this place in frightened whispers. They imagined piles of human bones, roaring monsters, and a savage giant who crushed men like dry branches. Mothers warned children about the island. Captains altered their course to avoid it. Every version of the tale ended the same way. The terrible Cyclops had been defeated by the clever Odysseus, but legends rarely returned after the hero sailed away. On a grey autumn morning, another giant climbed the rocky path leading toward the cave. His name was Brontes. Like his brother Polyphemus, he stood taller than the tallest pine, with a single great eye beneath a heavy brow and shoulders broad enough to block the cave's entrance. Yet, unlike his brother, Brontes carried no club upon his shoulder. He carried only a shepherd's crook cut from ancient olive wood. He had lived alone upon another distant island for most of his life, tending sheep and avoiding the quarrels of both gods and mortals. Cyclopes were not a people who gathered in cities. Each preferred his own mountain, his own flock, and his own silence. Years sometimes passed without one Cyclops seeing another. That was why the news had reached him so late. His brother had been blinded. At first, Brontes had refused to believe it. How could a handful of tiny mortals overcome a son of Poseidon? The story sounded like something sailors invented after drinking too much wine. Yet every passing merchant repeated the same name: Odysseus, king of Ithaca, the man clever enough to escape the impossible. Brontes expected to find only an empty cave. Instead, he found smoke rising gently from the entrance. Inside, dozens of sheep rested quietly upon fresh straw. Clay jars filled with milk lined the walls. A small fire burned beside a stone bed where an old giant sat listening to the crackling flames. Polyphemus. Time had bent his once mighty frame. His beard, once dark as volcanic stone, had turned completely white. Thick scars covered the empty socket where his single eye had once seen the world. His enormous hands searched carefully for the shepherd's staff resting beside him before he slowly stood. He recognized his brother's footsteps before hearing his voice. The two giants embraced without speaking. Neither had been taught to express affection with many words. Their silence said enough. Later, as evening settled outside the cave, Brontes prepared cheese while Polyphemus quietly milked one of his oldest ewes by touch alone. Every movement revealed years of practice. Blindness had stolen his sight, but not his patience. Only after they finished eating did Brontes finally ask the question that had brought him across the sea. What truly happened? The old Cyclops remained silent for a long time. The fire popped softly between them. "I was waiting for you to ask that," he said at last. Brontes expected anger. He expected curses against Odysseus. He expected promises of revenge. Instead, Polyphemus sighed. "I have spent many years listening to sailors anchor beyond the cliffs." A faint smile crossed his weathered face. "They tell magnificent stories." His fingers traced the scar across his empty eye. "In every one of them, I am a monster." Another silence settled over the cave. Then the old Cyclops spoke words Brontes had never imagined hearing. "I was not innocent." He admitted that he had ignored the sacred laws of hospitality. He had treated strangers as prey instead of guests. Pride had convinced him that strength excused cruelty, and the sea had eventually sent someone clever enough to prove him wrong. "Odysseus did not defeat me because he was stronger." The old giant looked toward the cave entrance, though he could no longer see it. "He defeated me because I had forgotten that fear makes monsters of us all." Brontes stared into the fire. Everything he believed about his brother suddenly seemed uncertain. Then Polyphemus made one final request. "Do not avenge me." His voice had become little more than a whisper. "Find out why men feared us long before they feared my name." Those were the last words Brontes heard from his brother before sleep claimed the old giant forever, leaving behind only silence, and a question that no legend had ever tried to answer. Polyphemus was buried before sunrise. Brontes chose a quiet hillside overlooking the sea, where the old Cyclops had spent countless evenings listening to waves he could no longer see. There were no priests to recite prayers, and no mourners gathered from distant villages. Cyclopes had never built temples, nor had they believed the gods paid much attention to their kind. The earth itself would remember. Brontes rolled an enormous boulder over the grave, not as a monument, but as protection against curious sailors. His brother had spent enough of his life as a legend. He deserved to rest as a shepherd. Before leaving the cave, Brontes looked around one last time. The place no longer resembled the prison described in every Greek tale. The sheep wandered peacefully between stone pens. Fresh cheeses rested on wooden shelves. Clay bowls had been neatly washed and stacked. Along one wall stood dozens of carved wooden flutes, each carefully shaped by hands too large for such delicate work. No songs mentioned that Polyphemus made music. No bard cared to mention it. Legends preferred monsters. Brontes gathered only 3 things before departing. His brother's shepherd's staff, a heavy wool cloak woven from black sheep's fleece, and the small wooden flute resting beside the stone bed. The cave disappeared behind him as he descended toward the shore. For the first time in his life, he left his own island not to find pasture or shelter, but answers. The crossing to mainland Greece took several nights. Brontes travelled only after sunset, walking across shallow reefs and swimming through narrow channels where merchant ships rarely ventured. During daylight, he hid inside sea caves, covering himself with driftwood and fishing nets whenever distant sails appeared on the horizon. The stories about humans fascinated him. They feared cyclopes. He had yet to meet one. Several days later, he reached the rugged coast of Aetolia. Before stepping inland, Brontes wrapped himself completely in the enormous black cloak. Its hood hid his single eye beneath deep folds of cloth, while the long fabric concealed most of his towering frame. From a distance, especially in poor light, he looked less like a giant and more like an unusually tall traveller leaning upon a staff. It was enough, at least from far away. He avoided roads whenever possible, choosing forests and mountain paths where only shepherds wandered. Even so, evidence of human life surrounded him. Fields stretched across hillsides. Smoke rose from distant villages. Children's laughter drifted through olive groves. The world seemed far busier than the lonely islands Cyclopes called home. Late one afternoon, Brontes heard shouting. He quietly climbed a rocky ridge overlooking a narrow road. Below, 3 armed men surrounded an elderly farmer beside an overturned cart. Apples had spilled across the dirt, and one of the robbers was kicking them aside while another demanded the old man's purse. The farmer could barely stand. His hands shook as he offered the small leather pouch hanging from his belt. Brontes watched silently. He remembered what Polyphemus had said. Find out why men feared us. If humans were so different from Cyclopes, why were they threatening one of their own? The robbers laughed as they pushed the old man to the ground. Brontes tightened his grip on the shepherd's staff. For the first time since leaving the island, he wondered whether monsters always looked the way legends claimed they did. Brontes remained hidden among the pines. The 3 robbers laughed as they emptied the old farmer's purse. A handful of bronze coins clattered into the dirt, followed by a small piece of cheese wrapped in cloth and a loaf of coarse barley bread. One of the men sneered. "So this is your fortune?" The others laughed harder. The oldest robber crushed the loaf beneath his sandal before kicking the farmer onto his side. They took the coins anyway. Before leaving, they slashed one wheel of the old cart with a knife, laughing as they disappeared down the road. Silence returned. The farmer remained on the ground for several moments before slowly trying to stand. His knees trembled beneath him. He managed only a few steps before collapsing beside the broken cart. Brontes watched. Among Cyclopes, strength decided nearly everything. A weak shepherd survived because a stronger one helped him. There was no glory in watching someone perish when assistance cost almost nothing. Yet Polyphemus's final request echoed in his thoughts. Learn about men. Brontes stepped from the trees. The earth seemed to shudder beneath his enormous feet. The farmer looked up. His weathered face turned white. The old man scrambled backward through the dust, his hands searching desperately for a stick that would never defend him. His mouth opened. No sound emerged. Brontes stopped several paces away. He understood. This was the fear his brother had spoken of. The farmer saw only a towering figure wrapped in a dark cloak. Not a traveller. Not a shepherd. A nightmare from every childhood story. Brontes slowly lowered his staff onto the ground. Then, without speaking, he walked toward the overturned cart. The heavy oak wagon would have taken 4 men to lift. Brontes raised it with one hand. The broken wheel dangled uselessly from its axle. He examined it carefully before pulling a young ash tree from the roadside as easily as another man might snap a reed. Sitting upon a large stone, he carved a new axle with surprising patience, using only a bronze knife, scarcely larger than a human sword. The farmer watched in stunned silence. Within minutes the cart stood upright once again. Brontes gathered the scattered apples one by one, carefully wiping dirt from each before placing them back into their baskets. He even recovered the crushed loaf of bread, brushing away loose dust, although he knew it could never truly be cleaned. Only then did he return to his staff. He still had not spoken. The farmer stared at the repaired cart, then at the silent giant. Fear remained in his eyes, but something else had appeared beside it. Confusion. Brontes turned to leave. Behind him came a hesitant voice. "Wait." The giant stopped. The old farmer slowly broke the uncrushed half of another loaf hidden beneath a blanket in the cart. His hand still shook as he held out the bread. It was a simple offering. The ancient law of hospitality. A stranger who helped deserved food. Brontes accepted the bread with astonishing care, holding the tiny loaf between fingers thick as branches. Neither smiled. Neither knew what to say. Yet in that quiet exchange, both realized something unexpected. The farmer had expected a monster and found kindness. Brontes had expected fearful hatred and found gratitude. As the giant disappeared back into the forest, the old man remained standing beside his cart. When he finally returned to his village that evening, no one believed the story he told, according to every legend in Greece. Cyclops did not stop to help strangers. The farmer's bread lasted Brontes 2 days. He carried the small loaf inside a leather pouch tied beneath his cloak, breaking off tiny pieces whenever hunger came. To a cyclops, it was hardly more than a mouthful, yet he refused to eat it quickly. It had been given freely. That made it valuable. As he continued south, the forest slowly gave way to vineyards, olive groves, and broad dirt roads crowded with travellers. Merchants pushed wagons loaded with pottery. Shepherds guided flocks towards summer pasture. Messengers hurried between cities carrying wax tablets sealed with royal crests. Human life seemed endless. Where one village ended, another began before sunset. Brontes remained well away from the roads. Even beneath his enormous cloak, hiding was becoming increasingly difficult. More than once, children pointed toward the unusually tall traveller, disappearing among the trees. A few curious shepherds followed him for short distances, before deciding they had already wandered farther from home than wisdom allowed. One evening, Brontes climbed a rocky hill overlooking a prosperous city, surrounded by thick stone walls. Smoke rose from hundreds of chimneys. The harbour below shimmered with merchant ships arriving from every corner of Greece. Music drifted upward from taverns beyond the gates. It was the largest human settlement he had ever seen. Curiosity overcame caution. After sunset, he approached. The streets outside the walls were nearly empty. Farmers were returning home with donkeys and carts, while a handful of merchants waited for the gates to open at dawn. Brontes kept his head lowered beneath the deep hood of his cloak and walked slowly, hoping the darkness would hide his size. For a few moments it worked. Then a little girl spotted him. She could not have been older than 6. Holding her mother's hand, she stared up at the towering stranger with wide eyes. Instead of screaming, she smiled. She waved. Brontes hesitated. Slowly, almost awkwardly, he lifted one enormous hand and waved back. The child giggled. Her mother turned to see what had caught her daughter's attention. The smile vanished instantly. She pulled the little girl behind her and shouted. Others turned. Someone pointed toward the impossible height of the cloaked traveller. A merchant cried that a giant had entered the road. Within seconds, panic spread through the crowd faster than fire through dry grass. People abandoned carts. Donkeys bolted. Children were snatched into waiting arms. The city guards rushed from the gate carrying spears and bronze shields, forming a trembling line across the entrance. Brontes did not move. The soldiers stared at him with the same terror he had seen in the old farmer's eyes. Only now there was no gratitude waiting behind it. Only fear. One officer demanded the stranger reveal himself. Brontes slowly lowered his hood. Moonlight fell across his broad face. His single eye reflected the torchlight. A gasp swept through the gathered crowd. "Cyclops!" The words spread like a plague. Stones flew before spears did. One struck Brontes across the shoulder. Another bounced harmlessly against his chest. A third, thrown by trembling hands, hit the wooden flute hanging from his belt and shattered it into splinters. Brontes looked down at the broken instrument. It had belonged to Polyphemus. His brother had carved it during the lonely years after losing his sight. For a long moment, the giant simply stared at the pieces lying in the dust. Then, without anger, without raising his staff, without taking a single step toward the frightened crowd, he turned around and quietly walked back into the darkness. Behind him, the city celebrated. The monster had fled. None of them realized that the only thing truly broken that night had not been the flute. It had been Brontes' growing hope that kindness alone could erase the weight of an old legend. Brontes left the city before dawn. The broken pieces of the wooden flute remained inside his pouch. He could not bring himself to throw them away. Every fragment reminded him of the quiet evenings his brother had spent carving melodies into wood after darkness had stolen his sight. Humans had never known that part of Polyphemus. They had known only the monster. The giant wandered east through the hills for several days without speaking to anyone. Whenever he heard voices upon the roads below, he changed direction. Whenever he saw smoke rising from a village, he chose another valley. Perhaps, he thought, the city had shown him the truth. One kind farmer could not outweigh an entire world raised on fear. One rainy evening, Brontes noticed the glow of a lonely fire beneath a rocky overhang. A single traveller sat beside it, wrapped in a worn blue cloak. Several scrolls lay stacked beside a leather satchel, protected carefully from the rain. The old man looked up as the enormous cloaked figure approached. Instead of reaching for a weapon, he simply moved his cooking pot away from the edge of the fire to make room. Brontes stopped. The old traveller smiled. "There is enough warmth for two." The giant remained standing. The old man studied the impossible height of his guest. "You've been walking for days." Brontes slowly sat on the opposite side of the fire, keeping his hood lowered. The traveller stirred a pot of lentils while humming quietly to himself. He introduced himself as Demades, a wandering poet who earned meals by telling stories from one town to another. The name meant little to Brontes. The profession interested him. Stories. Those were what had brought him here. The old poet eventually noticed the broken wooden flute resting beside the giant's enormous hand. He picked up one fragment. This was beautifully carved. Brontes nodded. "My brother made it." Demades smiled sadly. "It deserves remembering." He carefully returned the pieces. For a while, neither spoke. Only the rain filled the silence. Then voices echoed from the road below. Several merchants had stopped their wagons to escape the storm. Laughing loudly, they asked the old poet to entertain them while they waited. Demades stood and gladly accepted. Brontes remained hidden in the darkness beneath his cloak. The poet began telling the tale of clever Odysseus escaping the Cyclops. The merchants laughed at every mention of the foolish giant. They cheered when the burning stake blinded him. One child clapped excitedly as the Cyclops stumbled through his cave in pain. Brontes listened without moving. When the story ended, the merchants thanked the poet with bread and wine before continuing their journey. The rain finally stopped. Demades returned quietly to the fire. He stared into the glowing embers for a long moment before speaking. "That is not exactly how I believe it happened." Brontes slowly raised his head. The poet continued watching the fire. "Audience members prefer simple villains." He sighed. "They do not pay well for complicated truths." Brontes looked at the old man with growing curiosity. For the first time since leaving his island, someone had admitted that legends changed. Someone understood that stories often chose entertainment over honesty. The giant reached into his pouch and placed one piece of the broken flute beside the fire. Demades examined its careful craftsmanship once more. Then his eyes widened. Very slowly, he looked from the flute to the enormous traveller, and finally to the single eye hidden beneath the edge of the hood. The poet had spent his life telling stories about Cyclopes. Now, for the first time, one of them was listening. The old poet did not run. He did not shout for help. He simply looked at Brontes for a long moment, as though comparing the giant before him with the countless versions he had carried in his memory. Finally, he smiled. "So," he said quietly, "the story has found me instead." Brontes remained silent. He had grown accustomed to silence. It was safer than explanations. Demades placed another piece of wood onto the fire. "I've spent 40 years walking from city to city," he said. "I've told the tale of Odysseus and the Cyclops more times than I could ever count." He poked at the flames with a stick. "And every city tells me to make the giant crueler." Brontes tilted his head. The poet explained that audiences rarely wanted uncertainty. Heroes needed villains. Monsters needed sharp teeth. A frightened audience remembered simple stories far better than complicated ones. If the Cyclops had once laughed, no one wanted to hear it. If he had cared for sheep, no one applauded. If he had ever shown kindness, the tale became less exciting. So, little by little, each storyteller added something. The cave became darker. The giant became larger. The cruelty became greater. By the time the songs reached distant islands, the Cyclops had become something almost impossible to recognize. Brontes listened carefully. "So, people remember stories." Demades nodded. "They remember the version they enjoy most." The words settled heavily in the giant's thoughts. Perhaps Polyphemus had become a monster long before Odysseus ever reached his cave. Perhaps every new telling had simply carved away another piece of the truth. The fire burned lower. The old poet opened one of his scrolls. Its edges were worn from decades of travel. "I collect different versions," he explained. "The same story changes from village to village." He pointed to several passages. In one account, the Cyclops owned goats instead of sheep. Another claimed there were 2 Cyclopes. A third insisted Odysseus fought the giant with a bronze spear rather than a burning olive trunk. Each version contradicted the last. Yet every storyteller insisted his own was true. Brontes suddenly understood something humans had built that Cyclopes never had. Memory. Not personal memory, shared memory. Entire kingdoms lived according to stories repeated across generations. If those stories changed, people changed with them. Demades carefully rolled the scroll closed. There is one version I have never been able to confirm. He looked directly at Brontes. It says, Odysseus regretted what happened. The giant's eye narrowed. No hero regrets defeating a monster. The poet shook his head. No. He stared into the dying fire. But an old man might. Those words lingered between them long after the flames had faded. At dawn, the two travellers continued together. The poet now walked with slower steps, forcing Brontes to shorten his enormous stride. Neither minded. Several days later they reached a fishing village on the western coast. An old fisherman welcomed them with fresh bread, olives and dried fish. While preparing the meal, the fisherman casually mentioned that the elderly king of Ithaca had recently been seen travelling alone along the nearby coast, visiting the places where his long journey had begun. Demades slowly looked toward Brontes. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. After weeks spent searching for answers, the road was finally leading toward the one man whose story had changed both their lives forever. The road to Ithaca's western shore wound through olive groves older than most kingdoms. Brontes and Demades walked in silence, following the directions given by the fisherman. The old poet leaned on a weathered staff, while the giant remained hidden beneath his black cloak. Whenever travellers appeared on the road, Brontes stepped into the trees until they had passed. Word of a cyclops wandering Greece would spread far too quickly. By the afternoon of the third day, they reached a lonely stretch of coastline. There were no villages